So a day or two ago in Madison, Wisconsin, the statue of Hans Christian Heg was torn down, beheaded, and thrown into the lake. Now, this statue is just one of many that in the States, in Europe, and to some extent in Canada as well, are being torn down. Now, there are two things actually that disturb me about this story and the trend in general. So the first is the particularly bloodthirsty way in which this is happening. So now this statue, although it's an inanimate object, it's torn down, the head is ripped off, the body is dragged through the streets, and then thrown into the lake. Now there's a lot of rage, and we can have a whole discussion about justifiable anger. But there's a lot of rage that's being exemplified here, and I have to say that the image of what's going on is less like a cleansing and much more like a lynching. Dragging bodies through the streets, even in effigy, that should always be a cause for concern. So that's the first thing that gives me pause. The second thing is that Hans Christian Heg was an abolitionist. And what that means is that he's what we would consider one of history's good guys. So he was trying to free the slaves. So the fact that this statue is torn down, desecrated, ripped apart, paraded through the streets, thrown in the lake, it indicates that not only do we have rage, but we have blind rage, because people aren't even seeking to inform themselves anymore about what they're destroying. There's just this orgy of deconstruction going on where we just tear down anything old, assuming that it must, of course, be wrong. And so this causes me a good deal of concern. So there's a story from the Bible, I think, that can shed some light on what's going on. And this is actually one of the oldest. This is prehistory. This concerns Noah's three sons. So Noah, of course, is the man who built the ark. And after the whole episode with the ark, he became an agriculturalist. He had a nice homestead, a farm, and he planted a vineyard. And one day he drank too much wine. He passed out in his tent naked. And his youngest son, Ham, happened upon him naked in the tent. And he saw his father naked, and he ran out and started telling his brothers everything that he had seen. And as a result of this, Ham was cursed. So both Ham and his descendants were cursed to serve his older brothers. And to me, this always seemed like an odd story. Why would Ham be punished because his father got drunk and passed out naked? It didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me until it was explained. So if we look at the story, we have to think bigger than just a father and his son. So what do fathers represent? Well, certainly fathers represent tradition. They represent our culture. Even though we live in a much more egalitarian culture than we did generations ago, it's still largely a patriarchy. So it's certainly no stretch to say that fathers represent our culture. So everything that's been handed down to us. So what then does it mean when we see our culture naked? The first mention of nakedness happens with Adam and Eve. So after they've eaten the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they become self-aware. They become aware of themselves. They become aware of their sin. They become aware of their potential to do evil. They become aware of their shame. They become aware of their weakness, their limitations. They become aware of their vulnerabilities. So nakedness is this exposure and revelation of shame and vulnerability and weakness. So when Ham sees his father naked, he's seeing all the sins and the vulnerabilities of his culture. So he's seeing all the failings of his culture. Now his reaction is to run out and tell his brothers and say, guess what? And there's this bit and that bit, and guess what else I saw? So that's essentially what happened in the story. Now, we have to remember that despite his vulnerabilities and weakness and sins and getting drunk and naked, that Noah was still actually a great man, that despite the pressures from his culture, he persisted in building this ark that it was this safe structure that saved his family from the chaos and the destruction of the wider world. And that's what our culture still is today. We're living inside an ark that protects us. We don't worry about lions and tigers and things like that. We're so protected that we get to the point that our cell phone service is weak for a few minutes, and we think we're really hard done by. And yet I see that we're becoming very much like Ham, that we're starting to see some of the vulnerabilities and weaknesses and sins of our culture, and what we're doing is we're using that to poke holes in our ark, essentially. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing, that we do so at our own peril. Because as we turn our critical eye to history, which we are doing right now, we really need to examine our motives. So we have to make sure that when we're looking back at history and we're making our pronouncements and our judgments, that we're doing so with the intent of making our present and our future better. Ham wanted to mock his father in front of his brothers because it made him feel superior to do so. And I'm afraid that as a society that's actually the road that we're on right now. That we want to tear down the old to demonstrate how woke we are. Right? That it's all a method of virtue signaling. Right? That we're displaying our own moral superiority by tearing down all these things of the past. But we're doing so with both rage and with ignorance. And that's a really dangerous combination. So it brings to mind Proverbs 14, which I think I had mentioned actually in the last 2 weeks maybe. A wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands, the foolish woman tears hers down. So I would encourage us as we turn our eye towards history and we gaze upon the nakedness of our father, so to speak, that we really examine our motives, and that we do so with caution and with prudence, and that we make sure that we're not just gleefully tearing down our own house to demonstrate how morally superior we are, but that we're actually seeking to build a better present and a better future for our children and for ourselves.